Hi, I'm Joe Connolly. You have heard of our next guest's product. You probably even picked up one of his products because this is Bill Rouhana, the chairman of Chicken Soup for the Soul Books. And he could write a book himself on how to grow a business. And I wanted Bill to come in today to tell us how he has grown this wonderful brand and spun off all kinds of new product ideas. How many titles do you have of Chicken Soup for fill in the blank now?
We have about 250 books in print today, about 300 total when you look at the total in ebooks as well. It's quite a group.
Different versions? 250 different versions of Chicken Soup 4?
That's correct.
Wow, such as what? What are some of the titles?
Well, in the last year, we've done Chicken Soup for the Soul, Random Acts of Kindness. We're about to do Chicken Soup for the Soul, The Empowered Woman. I think you'll see that we try to stay current with those themes, but we cover everything from running to faith. It's a very broad group of categories that we cover because in all parts of life, people seek improvement, they seek a better life. There's no lack of places for us to go.
How do you come up with the ideas for titles?
I don't. My wife, who is also our publisher and who's done the last 150 titles, comes up with them. And I think she would say she reads the newspaper, and that's how she comes up with them, because she sees in current events quite often themes that she thinks should be explored and where stories from people will be helpful in advancing people's lives.
And then what does she and the company do then? Do you put out a proposal for writers to come in and develop this? Or work your personal network, or what?
So when we bought the business originally, Joe, in 2008, the internet was coming,
right,
but wasn't quite as pervasive as it is now, and the prior owners had used the mail. They would send out notices, put it in the newspaper, and they would get mailed in stories. You can imagine that the internet has made that a lot easier, as it's done with many other things. Today, we post call-outs for stories on our website, and we typically will get 5,000 or 6,000 submissions very rapidly, from which we choose 101 stories to go into our books. So it's a little like getting into college. It's a pretty selective process.
So if you put out an appeal for Chicken Soup for the Soul for runners, you might get 5,000 people saying, I have an article, I have a chapter.
They actually submit the stories.
They submit
them over the website. And then we have a staff of people who will read them. They kind of sort them out into categories. Eventually they'll submit, I'd say, the readers will cull it down to about 500 or so. Amy will then read all of them and choose the 101 that she thinks best exemplify the themes that she's seen repeated in the stories that have been submitted. Because there are sort of thematic, subsets of stories that repeat themselves.
Give us a glimpse into the mind of an entrepreneur and a venture investor like yourself. What was the opportunity that you saw in this product, this business that you bought from the two people who wrote the first book or two? You saw much more.
Clearly, there was something very big there. I could see it when I looked at it. Chicken Soup for the Soul was so well known. About 89% of Americans know Chicken Soup for the Soul. It's an amazing number. Only 90% of the Americans in the same survey by Gallup knew Ford. So if you can find me the 10% of the people who don't know Ford, I'd like to meet them because they would be interesting. But there was a big, big opportunity there. Lots of people knew the brand. And what was interesting to me, what was fascinating to me, was the fact that not only was it a big brand in books, but it had a very successful pet food brand called Chicken Soup for the Soul Pet Food. So I thought to myself, pet food, books, there's a lot of room between those two things that you could fill in with branding that might be very successful, and that's why we bought the company. We saw a great opportunity to fill in all of that space in between.
And it sounds like it must have been an even larger opportunity than you imagined. You're getting into videos now, and it seems endless. Where do you go now?
At the time, I thought that brands would become increasingly important because as I looked forward, the impact of the internet on our lives was, in my mind, going to create chaos and maybe too much choice. I think if you think about it today, there's a lot of choice. In fact, it's a little bit overwhelming for people. Some people say that it takes them 40 minutes to find a 30-minute television show to watch.
Yeah.
That's sort of out of whack. And I believe that was what freedom and choice and the Internet's development would create. And I thought inevitably, as a result of that, people would look for places that they could help sort out the content that they were receiving, and that brands would become increasingly important. So there was a long-term view that I had of buying Chicken Soup for the Soul, was that as a very well-known brand, it would be useful in a lot of other ways, especially related to the way content was delivered. That's turned out to be true. The freedom of choice that we have, the number of options that we have to do things as consumers has become a little bit overwhelming. And I think as we try to reorganize the way content is delivered, brands will become one filter through which people can learn what to choose, what's available. If that turns out to be right, then the Chicken Soup for the Soul online network group, which we're building, will end up being a huge success.
How would a company rebrand? Because you had a large brand, but it still had room for expansion.
Yes.
So its reputation never went bad. That was part of the asset.
Never went bad. It was actually, of all the things I've seen, it probably had the most positive reaction from people and the least negative reaction.
Right.
Sometimes you get high positives and high negatives in branding, but Chicken Soup for the Soul is just thought of as a positive brand, and we've tried to keep it that way by making sure that we stay focused on its essence, which is really helping people make their lives better. It's really about that. So if you stay true to the brand essence, I think you don't have to rebrand, you can expand your brand.
Do you believe that entrepreneurs are born or taught, made?
Nature versus nurture, huh? That's
Right.
the question
Right.
about all humans, I think. A bigger question than just entrepreneurs. I think entrepreneurs are both. I think they have to have a certain spirit, a certain way of looking at things, and then there's much to learn in order to be good at it.
I think they're born with an instinct to see, and then we all spend a lifetime learning to do what we do better. But there's an instinct that you saw there, and then you had to go deeper into it to see how good it was. It's just my impression, having been around entrepreneurs for many years.
Well, there's that vision thing,
Right.
that people talk about in general. Right. Do you see the future? Is
Right.
there something about the future that you believe is going to happen? If you see that, if your instinct is to look into the future, then of course you have a better shot at being an entrepreneur. Of course, you could be dead wrong.
Right.
And I think most of the time you are. And so the second part of being an entrepreneur has to be being persistent and understanding how to adapt to reality. And when your actual future view is challenged by real events, figuring out how to bring those two things together and keep on going. That's really the key.
When do you know, I assume there must have been some project in your past where you finally said, no, this is not going to work. When do you know when to stop pushing and move on?
Very hard question and a very hard decision to make, because you don't start something without believing in its possibilities. So you have to shift your view. We've had experiences like that at Chicken Soup for the Soul, where we've started something and it just hasn't quite worked. And it's for a variety of different reasons. Sometimes we're just dead wrong. We picked a product and nobody wants it. Okay, that's not great, but that's pretty obvious pretty quickly that you know. Where it gets harder is where things almost work. They kind of work. They're almost there. They're going over. They seem to be developing, and yet they don't quite get all the way. And that's really a tough decision. Now what do? We're almost there. How much more do we need to put into this? Can we keep going? That's a hard one, and it's very tough to know when to do that.
So what do? Do you set a limit, another 3 months and we'll decide, or another $1 million, we'll decide? How?
I think it's a frustration level issue. When you get right down to it, like everything else in life, there's a rational part of it, and then there's the emotional part of it.
Some morning you come in
and you just say, I've had enough.
I've had enough of this project.
It's done. I can't take it anymore. It's just too hard. There are things like that all the time in life. I mean, this is the same for everybody. It's not really any different.
It must be nice to be around, maybe it's not true every day, but positivity every day, because your message is positive. There must be a pleasant goal to pursue.
You know what's funny about that? That actually is right. And you don't even realize it as you're going through your life. But when you are exposed over and over again to positive stories, and when that's sort of the focus of your life, it does impact you. It does change the way you think about things. We call that being chicken soupy around our place. And we quite often ask each other when we're talking about something, is that chicken soupy? Or we might say, that's not chicken soupy. We shouldn't do that. It's a sort of standard. It's a way to live. It's an approach to life that you aspire to live to. We're all humans, so nobody does that all the time. But it is aspirationally right there in front of you all the time, and it makes a difference in your life.
Bill, you'd be a great guy to share a bowl of soup with. Thank you very much for coming in.
It is my pleasure.
Good luck.